Leo Carter had always felt that his heart belonged to the sky. From the moment he saw an airplane up close as a little boy, something about the colossal machine stirred a longing within him. While most children his age were consumed by video games, sports, or the latest superhero movies, Leo was captivated by flight. Not just the planes themselves, but the science, the complexity, and the sense of freedom they represented. It all began on his 10th birthday when his uncle James, a retired Air Force pilot, visited their small suburban home. James brought with him an old, slightly scuffed laptop and a flight simulator program. To Leo, it was the best gift he'd ever received. James spent hours explaining the basics of aviation, how lift worked, what the instruments in the cockpit meant, and how to maneuver a virtual plane. Leo hung on every word, his wide eyes reflecting the simulated clouds on the screen. "That's your horizon line," James said, pointing to the screen. "Keep it steady and remember, flying isn't just about speed. It's about balance and precision." Leo took those words to heart. Over the next 2 years, the flight simulator became more than just a game. It became a portal to the skies. He spent hours in his room mastering every nuance of the controls, from takeoff to landing. His small bedroom was soon transformed into a pilot's haven. Bookshelves were filled with aviation manuals borrowed from the library. Posters of sleek jets and powerful turboprops covered the walls. His desk, cluttered with maps, charts, and a makeshift joystick, was where he spent most of his time, living out his dream one simulated flight at a time. But for all his passion, Leo often felt like a bird trapped in a cage. His parents, Mark and Emily, didn't fully understand the depth of his obsession. Mark, a stern and practical man, worked long hours at a construction firm and believed in traditional paths to success: hard work, discipline, and a steady career. To him, Leo's constant tinkering with the flight simulator was nothing more than a waste of time. "Leo," Mark would say, shaking his head as he walked past his son's room, "you're spending too much time on that thing. How's it going to help you get into a good college?" "It's not just a thing, Dad," Leo would reply, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "I'm learning. I'm practicing for the future." Mark would sigh and mutter, "Flying planes isn't something you learn from a computer." Emily, on the other hand, had a softer approach. She wasn't as dismissive as Mark, but she worried that Leo was too focused on one thing. "Honey," she said one evening as she leaned against the doorframe of his room, "I know you love this, but you need balance. Go outside, play with your friends, or work on your school projects. You don't want to miss out on everything else life has to offer." Leo nodded, but inside, he felt a pang of loneliness. How could he make them see that this wasn't a hobby? It wasn't something he could just walk away from. Flying was his dream. It was his future. At school, things weren't much better. While other boys bragged about their scores in video games or their goals in soccer matches, Leo often found himself on the fringes. His classmates didn't understand his fascination with aviation. "Hey, plain boy," they teased, "why don't you fly us to lunch?" Leo tried to laugh it off, but their words stung. Still, he kept his head down, spending lunch breaks in the library reading about famous pilots and the evolution of aircraft. Despite the isolation, Leo's determination only grew. He started waking up earlier, sneaking in an hour of practice on the simulator before school. He meticulously planned his virtual flights, testing his limits by simulating emergencies or navigating through difficult weather conditions. He logged every hour, treating it as seriously as a real pilot would. One night, as the rest of the house slept, Leo sat at his desk with the glow of the computer screen lighting his face. The soft hum of the machine was the only sound, and the simulated horizon line stretched endlessly before him. His hands gripped the joystick tightly as he executed a perfect landing on a virtual runway. He leaned back in his chair, a rare smile spreading across his face. In that moment, he made himself a promise. No matter what obstacles came his way, whether it was his father's disapproval, his mother's gentle concerns, or the teasing from his peers, he would keep chasing his dream. One day, he wouldn't just be sitting in front of a simulator. One day, he would feel the hum of a real engine beneath him, the rush of wind as he soared through the clouds. Because Leo Carter wasn't just a boy playing at being a pilot. He was a pilot in the making, and nothing, Not even the weight of doubt from those around him could keep him grounded. The months that followed only deepened the divide between Leo and his parents. Mark's growing impatience with his son's obsession began to strain their relationship. Every day after school, Leo would rush to his room, eager to get back to his flight simulator, as if each minute spent in the virtual skies was another step closer to his dream. But the more Leo immersed himself in his passion, the more Mark became convinced that his son was wasting his potential. "Leo, this has to stop," Mark said one evening, his voice hard with frustration. He stood in the doorway of Leo's room, his broad arms crossed, blocking the only exit. The stern expression on his face was one that Leo had come to dread. Leo sat at his desk, hands gripping the joystick, his eyes glued to the screen, but he could feel his father's gaze like a weight on his shoulders. He didn't answer right away, hoping the silence would pass. "I said, this has to stop," Mark repeated, his tone sharper now. "You've got a test tomorrow, and you're sitting here playing these ridiculous games instead of studying. You've got to focus, Leo. This isn't a game. It's your future. Don't you get that?" Leo's heart pounded. The words he had heard so many times before echoed in his mind, but they no longer had the same power. He wasn't just playing, he was learning. He was working towards something greater. But how could he make his father understand? "I am studying," Leo finally said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm learning how to fly. This isn't just about some video game, Dad. It's real." Mark's face darkened. He stepped closer, his voice growing more insistent. "It's not real, Leo. None of this is real. You're just sitting in front of a screen pretending to fly. You're not a pilot, you're a kid. You need to be focusing on what's important: school, your future. All this nonsense is just distracting you from the things that really matter." Leo stood up from his chair, his heart pounding, but he forced himself to remain calm. "This is important," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand, but one day I will fly a real plane. I don't need anyone to believe in me but me." Mark's expression hardened, and for a moment, Leo thought his father might snap. But instead, Mark turned on his heel and walked out of the room, muttering something under his breath about wasting time. Leo stood there, his pulse racing, the sting of his father's dismissal cutting deep into him. His mother, Emily, always the peacemaker, entered the room shortly afterward. She was soft-spoken and kind, but even she couldn't mask the concern in her eyes. "Leo, honey," she began gently, sitting on the edge of his bed, "your dad's just worried. He wants you to succeed, but he doesn't know how to help you. Maybe you should take a break from the simulator for a while. Balance things out a little. You've got so many other opportunities in front of you." Leo swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to well up. He knew his mother meant well, but her words felt like a betrayal. Didn't she see how much this meant to him? Didn't she understand that his passion wasn't a phase, but his purpose? "I can't," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can't stop. I'm not asking anyone to understand, but I have to keep going. This is my dream, Mom. You don't understand it, and Dad doesn't either. But I know what I want." Emily sighed and nodded, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I just want you to be happy, Leo, but I also want you to be careful. Don't let this thing take over everything else. You can't just fly away from your responsibilities." Leo felt the weight of her words, but they only made his resolve stronger. His heart ached with the knowledge that his parents didn't believe in him the way he needed them to. But despite the pain, Leo remained silent. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when his dream was so close. The tension in the house only grew from that point on. Leo would lock himself in his room more often, escaping into his virtual world where he was in control, where he wasn't misunderstood. But in the back of his mind, the words his father had said replayed over and over. "You're wasting your potential. This isn't real." Leo didn't know how to prove his father wrong, but he knew he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to doubt himself now. He was getting closer to his goal with every flight, with every hour spent honing his skills, even if no one else could see it. One day, after another argument at dinner about his screen time, Mark slammed his fist on the table. "That's it. I'm cutting off your computer time, Leo. You're getting too distracted, and I won't let this continue." Leo's chest tightened. He felt the familiar frustration rising, but this time, something inside him snapped. "Fine," he said, his voice sharp and cold. "Take away my computer, take away the simulators, but I'll still be a pilot. You can't stop that." Mark looked taken aback, his face softening for a moment. "Leo." "No, Dad. I am a pilot, and nothing you do will change that." Leo stormed out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. That night, as he lay in bed, Leo stared out the window, his thoughts a whirlwind of frustration and determination. He knew things were never going to be easy with his parents. They couldn't understand his passion, couldn't see what he saw when he closed his eyes and imagined himself soaring through the sky. But Leo wasn't giving up. He couldn't afford to. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day for him to push forward, to keep chasing that dream, even if he had to do it alone. And nothing, not his father's harsh words, nor his mother's concern, would stand in his way. In an attempt to ease the growing tension at home, Emily suggested a family vacation, a break from the endless arguing, a chance to reset and reconnect. "What do you think about going to Hawaii?" she asked one evening over dinner, her voice tentative but hopeful. She knew Leo needed a break, but she also hoped it might be a chance for Mark to see the bigger picture, to step away from the constant pressure and see the boy his son had become. Mark, ever the pragmatist, was reluctant at first. He wasn't keen on the idea of taking time off from work, especially when the project deadlines were looming. But Emily's gentle persuasion wore him down, and after much back and forth, they decided to go. Leo, however, was less than thrilled. At first, he didn't see how a vacation would fix anything. His mind was still fixated on his flight simulator, on the dreams he had for his future. The thought of leaving behind his familiar space, the one place where he felt truly at home, seemed like another form of restriction. But Emily promised him that they would find some way for him to keep up with his aviation studies, as she gently called it. She suggested he take his tablet and download a few aviation apps for the flight. Leo reluctantly agreed, though he wasn't sure how much these apps could really help him. But deep down, he hoped the trip might offer something more, a chance to see the real thing, to witness the magic of flight in person. The flight to Hawaii was long, but Leo barely noticed the time pass. He spent most of it with his eyes glued to his tablet, watching virtual aircraft climb into the clouds and dive through the sky. He studied the routes, the cockpit controls, and the geography of Hawaii as if preparing for some distant test. When they finally arrived at their resort, nestled along the Hawaiian coastline, Leo's mood remained lukewarm. Sure, the place was beautiful, the turquoise waters, the lush greenery, and the sounds of the waves crashing against the shore, but it didn't compare to the sky. And that was where his mind lingered. The family spent their first day exploring the resort. Emily was insistent that they do something together, so they hiked to a nearby waterfall and swam in the clear, cool water. Mark was surprisingly relaxed, even joking with Leo about the hikes and the beautiful views. But Leo's heart wasn't in it. His thoughts drifted away to the airplanes he had seen on the way in. They flew overhead, leaving streaks of white against the blue sky, and Leo could almost feel the vibrations in his chest. Later that afternoon, while walking along the beach, Leo was drawn toward a group of pilots gathered near a small airfield. They were preparing for a sightseeing flight over the island, talking animatedly about the weather, the flight plan, and the stunning landscapes they'd be flying over. Leo couldn't resist. He walked over and approached one of the pilots, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. She was standing near a small, sleek aircraft, checking the fuel gauge. "Excuse me," Leo said, his voice a little shaky but filled with determination. "Are you a pilot?" The woman smiled warmly, noticing the genuine curiosity in his eyes. "I sure am. I'm Captain Sarah. You looking to become a pilot yourself?" Leo nodded enthusiastically. "I want to be a pilot more than anything. I've been flying flight simulators for years now, but I want to fly for real someday." Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Well, you're off to a good start. Those simulators are no joke. They're great for learning the basics and understanding the fundamentals of flying. But the real thing is, well, it's a whole different experience." She gestured toward the cockpit of the plane. "You ever been in a real plane before?" Leo shook his head, his eyes wide with excitement. No, but I've always wanted to. I study everything about flying. I want to learn how to handle the plane, understand the controls, the engines, all of it. Sarah's smile grew even wider. Well, why don't you hop in with us for a bit? We're doing a scenic tour of the island. It's a great way to see the world from a different perspective. Leo's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced with excitement. Was this really happening? He had dreamed of this moment for so long. Being in the cockpit, seeing the world from the perspective of a real pilot. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. Before he could respond, Mark and Emily walked over, clearly puzzled by the conversation. What's going on here? Mark asked, his brow furrowing. Leo turned to his parents, his excitement barely contained. I was just talking to Captain Sarah. She's a real pilot. She offered to let me sit in on their flight. Could I, Mom? Please. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Emily placed a hand on his arm, sensing the importance of the moment. Let's think about it, Mark. He's not asking to fly, just to sit in. It could be a great learning experience for him. Mark hesitated, his eyes darting between Leo and the plane. I don't know, Emily. This feels a little extreme. He's never been in a plane before. What if something goes wrong? But Emily's voice was calm and reassuring. He's with a professional pilot. It's safe, Mark. And maybe this will help him see what it's really like to fly. If it's what he wants, maybe we should let him try. After a long pause, Mark finally relented with a reluctant sigh. Fine, just for a short time. Leo's heart soared. He could hardly believe it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He thanked his parents profusely before turning back to Captain Sarah. You're going to love it, Sarah said with a wink. Let's get you set up. As they boarded the small aircraft, Leo felt a thrill he had never experienced before. He climbed into the co-pilot seat, the leather straps of the seatbelt tight around him. The view of the island from the cockpit was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The vast ocean stretched out to the horizon, dotted with small islands and lush forests. The mountains rose dramatically in the distance, and Leo felt a sense of wonder wash over him. As the engines roared to life and the plane took off, Leo's heart raced with excitement. He sat up straighter, absorbing every detail. He watched as Captain Sarah adjusted the controls, her movements precise and confident. Every inch of the cockpit seemed like a treasure trove of knowledge he was eager to understand. Maybe one day, you'll be in my seat, Sarah said, glancing at Leo as the plane leveled out. Leo smiled, his eyes alight with the kind of joy only a true aviation enthusiast could know. I will. One day, I'll fly a plane just like this. The flight was everything Leo had dreamed of, and more. The view from above was breathtaking, and the sensation of being in the air, feeling the plane's subtle shifts as it maneuvered through the skies, was unlike anything he had ever felt. As they flew over the island, the world below seemed to fade away, leaving only the thrill of the journey. In that moment, Leo knew he was on the right path. The sky was his future. Nothing else mattered. And no matter what his parents thought, he was going to chase this dream until it became his reality. The next few days in Hawaii were filled with excitement, but nothing compared to the rush of being in the cockpit of that plane, soaring over the island with Captain Sarah. The thrill of that experience stayed with Leo, his mind buzzing with new information, his heart filled with the belief that he was one step closer to his dream. It was the kind of feeling that couldn't be contained, a rush that made everything else seem insignificant in comparison. Leo couldn't wait to tell his parents about it. He wanted to show them that this wasn't just a phase, that his passion for flying was more than just a fantasy. But despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't fully understand. They were still focused on the idea of him getting back to reality, of pursuing something more practical. The thought made him frustrated, but he kept it to himself, not wanting to spoil the vacation. That was until the day the calm of their vacation was shattered in an instant. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as the family settled into their seats for their return flight home. Leo stared out the window, the ocean stretching out endlessly beneath them, the gentle hum of the engines lulling him into a sense of peace. It was a smooth flight, and for the first time in days, Leo felt truly at ease. But then, without warning, the calm was broken. The flight attendants began to move with a sense of urgency. Leo glanced around, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. He could hear voices in the cabin, raised voices, frantic murmurs. The usual hum of the aircraft seemed to fade into an eerie silence, replaced by an unsettling tension that filled the air. Suddenly, the seatbelt sign flashed on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, his tone calm but with an underlying edge of concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. We will keep you updated as we proceed." Leo's stomach tightened. He had flown enough times to recognize the difference between a routine announcement and one that hinted at something more serious. He glanced at his parents, who were both looking out of their seats with a mixture of concern and confusion. Mark's brow furrowed as he looked around, trying to assess the situation, while Emily gripped the armrest, her face pale. Leo felt a twinge of fear, but his mind raced. He had spent countless hours studying planes, their systems, and the basics of flight. He knew what to do in an emergency, at least in theory. But this wasn't a simulator, and this wasn't some theoretical exercise. This was real. Then, a sudden shift in the plane's movement jolted him from his thoughts. The aircraft dipped unexpectedly, and a gasp rippled through the cabin. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the plane seemed to lose its stability, shaking violently. The sound of alarms blared throughout the cabin, and Leo's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. He could hear the flight attendants shouting orders to passengers, their voices strained and hurried. "Remain in your seats. Buckle up." But the panic in their voices only heightened the sense of chaos that gripped the cabin. Leo's eyes widened as he saw two of the attendants rush toward the cockpit, their faces pale and anxious. It was then that Leo overheard a conversation between two of the flight attendants, their voices low but urgent. "The captain and co-pilot, both are unconscious," one of the attendants said, her voice trembling. "We're going to need to do something fast. The plane's losing altitude." Leo's blood ran cold. The situation had just escalated from a mechanical issue to a crisis. Without a pilot, they were helpless. In that moment, Leo's heart raced, not from fear, but from a sense of duty. He had trained for this, in a way. His countless hours on the flight simulator had prepared him for scenarios like this, even if they had always felt distant, theoretical. This wasn't a game. He wasn't playing. This was real. He pushed his fear aside and stood up, his mind working faster than his heart could beat. He had to do something. Taking a deep breath, Leo made his way toward the front of the cabin. His steps were sure and steady, each one bringing him closer to the cockpit. He could feel the tension in the air, a heavy weight pressing down on him as the flight attendants scrambled around him, trying to keep the passengers calm. When he reached the cockpit door, Leo knocked gently, trying not to startle anyone inside. But the door didn't open. He could hear the frantic voices of the flight attendants speaking to someone on the other side. "Please, open the door." Leo called out. "I can help. I know what to do." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances before one of them slowly approached the door and peered through the small window. She hesitated for a long moment, and then finally, with a look of reluctant hope in her eyes, she spoke. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Leo nodded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I've been flying simulators for years. I can help. Please, just let me in." With a look of disbelief, the flight attendant stepped aside and opened the door. Inside, the cockpit was a flurry of confusion. The captain was slumped over in his seat, unconscious, while the co-pilot sat slumped at his controls, unresponsive. The instruments were flashing red, warning lights blinking in a chaotic rhythm. The air traffic controller's voice came over the radio, muffled but clear. "We're aware of the situation. What is your status?" The flight attendant looked at Leo, and then back at the air traffic controller. She stepped aside, giving Leo room to approach the captain's seat. "Can you fly the plane?" the flight attendant asked, her voice shaking. Leo felt a surge of determination. He nodded again, more firmly this time. "I can. I've practiced this. Just guide me through it." With a deep breath, Leo slid into the captain's seat. The cockpit felt different than the simulators he was used to. More real, more serious. But his training kicked in. He reached for the controls, fingers brushing over the buttons and levers, feeling the weight of each decision he made. He spoke to the air traffic controller, his voice steady as he followed their instructions. Honolulu, this is Flight 497. I'm taking control of the aircraft. Please advise on next steps. The controller's voice crackled over the radio, calm but urgent. Understood, Flight 497. We have you on radar. Maintain altitude and follow our guidance. You are cleared to land. Leo's pulse raced as he worked to steady the plane. He could hear the crackling static of the radio, but he focused on the tasks at hand. His mind was clear, his hands steady as he adjusted the plane's altitude, keeping it from descending too rapidly. He felt the weight of the lives on board, but he couldn't afford to let fear control him. He was a pilot now. The atmosphere in the cockpit was thick with urgency. Leo's hands moved instinctively over the controls, his mind racing as he listened to the instructions coming from the Honolulu air traffic controller. The words they spoke were laced with the gravitas of the situation, but Leo wasn't distracted. His training, albeit on a simulator, had prepared him for the kind of challenge he now faced. The cockpit felt both foreign and familiar, and yet there was no time to dwell on the differences. He was aware of the gravity of the moment, but there was no room for fear. There were lives in his hands, people who trusted that the plane would make it safely back to the ground. His parents, Emily and Mark, were somewhere in the cabin, unaware that their son had just stepped into the shoes of a professional pilot. Leo's heart raced with each command given by the controller, but his thoughts were crystal clear. He would not let this plane go down. As Leo gripped the controls, adjusting the throttle and monitoring the plane's descent, he could hear the faint murmur of voices behind him, the flight attendants moving frantically throughout the cabin, trying to manage the panic among the passengers. There was chaos outside the cockpit, but here, in this small, enclosed space, Leo found focus. The sound of the engines hummed, steady and reassuring, even as the plane's altitude fluctuated. His eyes scanned the dials and gauges, checking for any signs of distress, and yet there was a nagging sense in his mind that this wasn't enough. What if he couldn't make it? What if he didn't know enough? But just as quickly as those thoughts entered his mind, he shut them out. He had to keep going. He could do this. His dream of becoming a pilot had led him here, and though he never imagined this would be the way he'd get his chance, he was determined to prove that he belonged in this seat. Outside the cockpit window, Leo could see the deep blue of the Pacific Ocean stretching out in all directions, an endless sea below. The lights of Honolulu were beginning to come into view, flickering like stars as they approached the airport. But the runway was still too far. Honolulu, this is Flight 497, Leo said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside his chest. We are descending. Please advise on our approach to the runway. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through the headset. Flight 497, you are cleared to begin your approach. We have the runway in sight. Maintain heading 270 degrees and adjust for descent. Leo's fingers danced over the controls as the plane adjusted course, following the instructions he was receiving. He could feel the plane's descent now, more pronounced as the wheels seemed to inch closer to the earth. He glanced out of the cockpit window again, focusing on the distant runway. His mind quickly worked through the approach process, lining up with the center line, reducing the speed, adjusting the flaps, and finally, aligning the nose of the plane to meet the runway. Every part of his mind was engaged in the process. The steps he had practiced over and over in his simulators were now playing out in real time. He had never felt more alive. But as he descended further, a voice behind him startled him, a low, uncertain whisper that came from one of the flight attendants. Are you sure you can land this plane? She asked, her voice edged with worry. Leo turned slightly to see her standing just behind the cockpit door, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and doubt. It was a moment of vulnerability. This woman, who had never expected to put her trust in a 12-year-old boy, now depended on him to save them all. Leo took a deep breath, his hands tightening on the yoke. The question lingered in the air, the weight of it almost suffocating, but he refused to let it shake him. I know what I'm doing, Leo replied, his voice firm. Just trust me. I'll get us down safely." The flight attendant nodded, though there was no hiding the uncertainty in her eyes. She stepped back, and Leo returned his focus to the task at hand. "Honolulu, this is Flight 497, Leo said, his voice clear and authoritative now. "We're preparing for the landing. Please guide me through the final steps." The air traffic controller responded quickly, offering a series of commands and calculations that Leo took in stride. He carefully adjusted the plane's speed, watching as the runway grew closer and closer. The engines rumbled beneath him, a constant reminder of the power he was wielding. Power that only a real pilot should have at this moment, not a young boy with dreams too big for his age. And then, just as the plane crossed the threshold of the runway, the final moments arrived. Leo pulled back on the control column, easing the nose up slightly, maintaining just the right speed, and gently flaring the plane as it touched down on the runway. The wheels screeched against the tarmac, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Leo's heart pounded in his chest as he kept his eyes glued to the runway, his hands still gripping the controls as though he were still in the air. And then, the plane finally came to a stop. The entire cabin seemed to exhale in relief, as if the collective breath of every passenger had been held for what felt like an eternity. The plane was on the ground. It was safe. They were safe. Leo sat there, his hands trembling on the controls. He hadn't realized just how much of himself he had poured into that landing until now, how the pressure, the fear, and the overwhelming responsibility had weighed on him. The flight attendants entered the cockpit, their expressions a mixture of awe and gratitude. "You did it," one of them said, her voice trembling. "You landed the plane. You saved us all." Leo nodded silently, unable to fully grasp what had just happened. It was as if his body had done the work while his mind had barely kept up. The enormity of the situation would sink in later, but for now, he couldn't help but smile. He had done it, and it wasn't just a dream anymore. It was reality. The roar of applause that erupted from the passengers reverberated through the cabin, a wave of relief and gratitude sweeping over the entire flight. Leo sat frozen in his seat, still gripping the controls as the aircraft slowly came to a full stop on the runway. The harsh reality of what he had just accomplished hit him like a wave, crashing over his senses. His hands, which had been steady throughout the flight, now trembled with the aftershocks of adrenaline. He had landed the plane. He had landed the plane. A 12-year-old boy, who had spent more time with flight simulators than with his classmates, had just flown an actual airplane. The weight of the moment began to sink in, but Leo barely had time to process it before the cockpit door opened. One of the flight attendants, a woman with wide eyes and a shaky smile, stepped inside, her voice filled with disbelief. You really did it, kid. You brought us home. We're safe. We're all safe." Leo couldn't help but feel the weight of her words, and in the back of his mind, the question that had been gnawing at him since the moment he had taken control of the aircraft finally started to fade. Had he really been ready for this? But as the reality of the situation settled into him, there was no turning back now. The passengers had trusted him, and they were safe. That was all that mattered. For the briefest moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, breathing deeply and trying to steady his heartbeat. The reality of what he'd just done, what he'd just experienced, hadn't fully dawned on him. His thoughts raced, bouncing from the flashing lights in the cockpit to the feeling of the plane's wheels skimming the runway, then to his parents, his mom and dad, who were somewhere back in the cabin, unaware of the incredible feat he'd just pulled off. And then, before he could grasp the significance of the moment, a sharp voice crackled through his headset. "Flight 497, you're clear to taxi to gate 32. Please follow the instructions of ground control." The air traffic controller's calm voice grounded him, snapping him back to the present. Leo swallowed hard, nodded to himself, and keyed the microphone. "Roger that. Flight 497, taxiing to gate 32. The cockpit now felt more like his world than ever before. His hands adjusted the throttle, slowly steering the massive aircraft down the taxiway as he was guided by the flashing lights from the airport ground crew. For a few seconds, Leo couldn't help but smile to himself, the enormity of what he had just accomplished still fresh and surreal. He had done it. Against all odds, he had done it. The plane was now safely on the ground, and it was his actions that had made it happen. In the cabin, the applause continued. Leo's ears buzzed with the sound of cheering passengers, their faces alight with relief. The flight attendants were doing their best to keep things under control, ushering people to their seats as the excitement spread through the plane. Even from the cockpit, Leo could hear the muffled voices and the shuffling of feet as the passengers, most of whom had been on the edge of panic just minutes ago, slowly began to calm down. But what did all of this mean for Leo? What would it mean for his parents when they found out? He knew his parents, Mark and Emily. They were smart, practical people, grounded in reality. They hadn't fully understood his passion for flying before, had dismissed it as a childhood obsession. Mark especially had been critical of his fascination with flight simulators, thinking it was a distraction from schoolwork and real-world responsibilities. How would they react when they found out that their son had just saved an entire flight? A sinking feeling hit his stomach. He had taken the reins when no one else could. But would they even believe him? The plane turned onto the final stretch toward Gate 32, and Leo's thoughts drifted to the faces of his parents. He hadn't seen them in the cockpit yet, but the thought of them finding out made him anxious. Would they be proud of him? Or would they see it as a fluke, a mere accident? He was so focused on the fear of what they might think that he barely noticed the plane easing to a halt in front of the gate. The ground crew was waiting, ready to guide the aircraft into its parking spot. Leo's fingers were still gripping the controls, the weight of the moment still heavy in his chest, but he slowly disengaged the autopilot and gently guided the plane into its final position. When the aircraft came to a complete stop, he turned off the engines and let out a long, shaky breath. He had done it. He had actually done it. It was the first time in his life he had felt completely alone in such a monumental way. No one to lean on, no one to help him, just him and the plane and his willpower. It had been him who had made it through. A soft knock on the cockpit door broke his moment of reflection. Leo turned to find a flight attendant standing there, her face a mix of exhaustion and awe. "Kid, we're on the ground," she said softly. "You did it. You landed the plane. We all owe you our lives." Before Leo could respond, she stepped back, and the door opened fully. Emily, his mother, and Mark were standing there. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Leo?" Emily's voice was trembling. "Is it really you?" The way his mother said his name made Leo's heart stop for a beat. She had been so worried about him before, always trying to balance her concern with support, but now, her gaze was full of something else, full of awe. Mark, too, was staring at him, his face still in shock. You did this?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. Leo nodded, swallowing hard. His voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. I did it. I landed the plane." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then both his parents seemed to let go of the breath they'd been holding. "I don't know how," Emily's voice broke as she stepped closer to him, her hands trembling as she placed them on his shoulders. "But Leo, you were incredible." Mark, still in shock, stood there for a moment longer before he, too, stepped forward. I thought this was just a phase. I thought you'd grow out of it." His voice was thick with emotion, a mix of pride and confusion. "But you've shown us all that you were right all along." Leo blinked, the reality of his accomplishment settling in as his parents' voices finally broke through the fog in his mind. They were proud of him, not just because he had saved everyone on the plane, but because they finally understood that this wasn't just a phase, it was his calling. This was who he was meant to be. "Dad, Mom, I want to be a pilot," Leo said, his voice steady now, as if the weight of his dreams had been lifted from his chest. "I want to fly for real." Mark and Emily exchanged a glance, and then, without a word, they both nodded. In that moment, Leo knew they had finally seen him for who he truly was, and he could feel the future opening up in front of him, clearer and more certain than ever before. As the plane came to a complete stop and the engines began to hum quietly, a wave of surreal calm washed over Leo. His hands were still gripping the controls, though now it felt less like an urgent need to keep the plane from falling from the sky and more like a symbolic gesture, almost as if he wanted to hold on to the moment a little longer, to savor the enormity of what he had just done. to breathe in the rare, heady feeling of having conquered the impossible. Through the cockpit window, he could see the ground crew approaching, waving their hands, signaling that everything was okay. They had landed. It was over. The aircraft was safe on the ground, and the passengers were safe too. But despite the calming atmosphere around him, Leo's mind was racing. His parents were somewhere back in the cabin, and they had no idea that their son had just single-handedly saved the flight. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft tap on the cockpit door. Leo turned and saw the flight attendant from earlier standing there, her face pale but filled with awe. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "You landed the plane. Everyone's safe because of you." Leo nodded mutely, unsure of how to respond. His emotions were in a jumble: pride, disbelief, excitement, and fear all mixed into one overwhelming sensation. He had just done something that no one would believe, even though he had done it with nothing but the hours of practice spent in front of flight simulators. But the journey wasn't over yet. He still had to face the people who mattered most, his parents. With the flight attendants working to get the passengers organized and the ground crew starting to help with the disembarking process, Leo finally unstrapped himself from the pilot's seat and stood up. The movement felt strange, as if his body had forgotten how to walk on solid ground after what had felt like hours of focus and adrenaline. He pushed the cockpit door open and walked out into the cabin, where he was immediately met by the gazes of several passengers who had gathered near the entrance, waiting for the chance to exit. When they saw him, their expressions shifted from fatigue to wonder. There were murmurs of disbelief, some claps of approval, and a few people even stepped forward, eager to thank him. "You're the one who landed the plane, right?" one woman asked, her eyes wide. "My God, we all owe you our lives." Leo felt uncomfortable under the weight of their gratitude. He had done what he had to do, but he wasn't sure how to react. Instead of speaking, he gave a slight nod and continued toward the back of the plane, where his parents were anxiously waiting for him. He found them seated together near the rear. His mother, Emily, was gripping Mark's hand tightly, her eyes wide, her lips trembling in disbelief. And Mark, Leo's dad, looked like he had just witnessed a miracle. His mouth hung slightly open as he stared at Leo, unable to comprehend what had just happened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Leo!" Emily's voice broke the silence, soft and full of wonder. "Is it really you?" Her voice trembled as she looked at him, searching for something in his face, something that would confirm the reality of the situation. Leo took a deep breath and nodded, his hand still shaking slightly. "Yeah, Mom. It's me." His voice was steady, though there was a tightness in his chest that he couldn't quite shake. Mark shook his head slowly, as if trying to make sense of it. "I don't understand. You actually landed the plane?" Leo nodded again, now feeling a wave of exhaustion crash over him. The weight of everything, the sheer responsibility of what he had done, the toll it had taken on his body and mind, finally hit him. But he didn't want to appear weak, not now. Not when his parents were finally understanding him. "I did. I just used everything I knew from the simulators. The controllers helped guide me through the rest." Leo's words came in a rush as he tried to explain. "I couldn't just sit there. I had to do something." For a long moment, Mark said nothing, still processing. Emily reached out, taking both of Leo's hands in hers. I don't know how to feel, Leo. I've been so worried about you. Worried you were too focused on these simulators, too distracted from everything else." Her voice was full of emotion now, her eyes welling up with tears. "But I see now, this wasn't just a hobby for you. It was your dream. And you made it come true, just like that. You saved everyone." The tears in Emily's eyes seemed to pull at Leo's heartstrings, and for the first time, he felt the full impact of what he had done. He hadn't just saved strangers. He had changed everything for himself, for his parents, for his future. Mark, who had remained quiet until now, cleared his throat and spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't think it was possible. I didn't understand how serious this was for you, Leo." He took a step closer, putting a hand on Leo's shoulder. "But I see it now. I see what you've been telling us all along." Leo looked up at his father, searching his face for something. A sign of pride, maybe, or at least some recognition. And what he found was more than he could have hoped for. There was awe, yes, but more than that, there was respect. "Leo, I'm proud of you," Mark said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "You did what I never thought you could. You showed us all what you're really capable of." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and Leo felt his heart swell with relief. Finally, his parents were seeing him. Not as the kid who spent hours playing flight simulators, not as the boy with dreams that seemed impossible, but as a young man with real talent, with a future that was now wide open. "I want to be a pilot," Leo said softly, looking up at both of them with newfound confidence. "I want to do this for real. I'm not going to stop." Emily and Mark exchanged a glance. For the first time, there was no hesitation in their eyes. No disbelief. No concern. Only a quiet understanding. "You will," Emily said firmly, her voice full of warmth and pride. "You will." The weight of the world seemed to lift from Leo's shoulders as his parents stood together, surrounding him with their love and support. He had proven himself in the most dramatic of ways, and now they were ready to back him up. His dream wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs too. Leo smiled, a real smile, feeling the first spark of excitement about the future he had been holding on to for so long. A future that was finally within his reach. The cockpit was filled with a sharp, focused silence as Leo's fingers gripped the controls, his entire body tense with a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. The vast expanse of the runway stretched out ahead, the blinking lights guiding him as he slowly descended toward the earth. For a moment, the world outside the cockpit felt like a blur. Everything outside the glass panel seemed distant, unimportant. It was just him, the plane, and the soft crackle of the air traffic controller's voice in his ear. "Flight 497, you're coming up on your final approach. Maintain altitude, and we'll guide you in." The calm, authoritative voice of the air traffic controller crackled through the headset. The words were no longer just instructions, they were a lifeline. Leo's mind raced as he flicked switches and made minor adjustments to the plane's course. The hours he'd spent on the flight simulators, the countless virtual flights where he'd practiced this exact moment, had prepared him for this. But nothing could prepare him for the weight of it, the responsibility, the pressure. As his heart hammered in his chest, he could feel his palms sweat despite the coldness of the cockpit. He was no longer just a boy playing a game. He was a pilot, a real one. His mind raced back to the moments before, when everything had started to spiral. The pilot and co-pilot had collapsed, their bodies slumping against their seats, leaving the entire plane in free fall. The chaos in the cabin had been overwhelming at first, but then, when he had stepped up, when he had taken charge, everything had shifted. The passengers had calmed. The flight attendants had trusted him. And now, the only thing left was to land the plane safely. His entire future, his entire dream, depended on the next few moments. "You're doing great, Flight 497. You're right on track." The controller's voice came through again, steadying his nerves. Leo nodded silently, his mouth dry. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but there was no time for fear, no time for second-guessing. He had to focus. He adjusted the throttle just slightly, keeping the nose of the plane steady as it began its final descent. The lights on the runway grew larger, brighter. The air felt heavier, thicker, almost as if the weight of the entire world had descended upon the plane. His stomach twisted into a knot. The ground was coming closer. He could see the runway more clearly now, the dashed lines marking the center, the solid white borders of the lane. His breath hitched, but he remained steady, keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon. The controls felt familiar. The way the plane responded to his commands felt right. He had trained for this. He had practiced hundreds of simulated landings, each one a step closer to this moment. But no matter how many virtual flights he had completed, nothing could have prepared him for the real thing. "You're almost there. Lower your altitude to 300 feet. Keep the nose level," the air traffic controller advised, her voice now softer, almost encouraging. Leo nodded, his hands moving instinctively as he made the necessary adjustments. He felt the slight dip of the plane's nose and corrected it, keeping the descent steady, steady, steady. A low hum filled the cockpit as the wheels of the plane lowered slightly, the turbulence of the air causing a slight shake. Leo gripped the yoke tighter, his knuckles white. Flaps down to 40 degrees, the controller instructed, and Leo responded immediately. The plane shifted slightly, its wings adjusting as he lowered the flaps, allowing for a slower, more controlled descent. The runway was just ahead, its details becoming sharper now. Leo could see the white lines of the landing strip, the slight incline of the ground as it led toward the terminal. He adjusted the throttle, bringing the plane in lower, more controlled. A sense of calm, almost like a second wind, seemed to wash over him. The cockpit, the world outside, all of it seemed to fall away, leaving only the essential task before him, landing the plane. A few more seconds passed, each one feeling like an eternity. He could hear the control tower's voice still in his ear, its steadiness guiding him. He was in control now, but he could feel the eyes of the passengers, the flight attendants, and his parents. He could almost feel the collective breath of everyone on the plane being held as they watched him. 300 feet. 200 feet. The controller continued to count down, her calm voice a steady metronome. Approaching the runway. Steady now, Flight 497. You're doing great. Leo exhaled slowly. There was no room for doubt. He had to land this plane, no matter what. The wheels of the plane were now only a few feet from the tarmac, the ground rushing up toward him. With a final, careful adjustment, Leo tilted the yoke back slightly, lifting the nose just enough to bring the plane in on a perfect line. The landing gear hit the ground with a solid thud, the plane's wheels screeching against the asphalt as it made contact. Leo's heart skipped a beat as he fought to maintain control, feeling the weight of the plane shift under him. The landing was rough, turbulent, but he kept his hands steady, his movements calm. The plane bounced slightly, but Leo held his breath, kept the throttle steady, and brought the plane back down to the ground with a controlled, if somewhat bumpy, landing. The tires screeched again as the plane slowed, the force of gravity pulling it closer to the earth. The runway stretched out ahead, endless and firm, a solid surface that would carry them safely to a stop. You're down. You're safe. Flight 497. The controller's voice came through again, this time filled with relief. And then, as if on cue, the cabin erupted into applause. The sound of clapping, cheers, and shouts of gratitude filled the air, and Leo felt himself freeze in place, unable to move or react at first. The pressure of the moment suddenly seemed to lift, as if it had been held in place by an invisible force all this time. For the first time since he had taken control of the aircraft, Leo allowed himself to take a deep breath and let it out slowly. The plane was down. He had done it. But the applause, the cheers, they weren't for the landing. They were for him. They were for the boy who had saved their lives, for the young pilot who had risen to the occasion, for the dreamer who had turned his fantasy into reality. His heart was still racing, his pulse quick, his body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline. But Leo was alive. The passengers were alive. They were all safe. The sound of the applause didn't stop, and the realization hit him in a wave. He had not just saved the flight. He had changed everything. This was more than just a chance to prove himself. This was the moment that had cemented his future. And as the plane slowed and came to a full stop, Leo looked out the cockpit window at the growing crowd of ground staff, security, and even a few press photographers, all waiting to catch a glimpse of the hero who had made the impossible possible. The boy with a dream had just landed a plane, and there was no turning back now. The plane had barely come to a stop before the cabin erupted into chaos, a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief that had everyone in a frenzy. Passengers were talking over each other, their faces flushed with excitement, some hugging complete strangers, others crying in gratitude. The applause that had erupted after the plane touched down had been deafening, echoing throughout the cabin. People were standing up, clapping, reaching for their phones to capture the moment, as though they couldn't believe what had just happened. Leo, still in the cockpit, was frozen. He sat there for a few seconds, unsure of how to react. The moment was surreal, his thoughts racing in a whirlwind of emotions. His mind was still replaying the landing, the way the controls had felt in his hands, the air traffic controller's calm voice guiding him, and the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of bringing the plane down to safety. His fingers twitched at his sides, still buzzing with the adrenaline that hadn't quite faded. After a few moments, one of the flight attendants knocked gently on the cockpit door. "Are you all right, Leo?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a mix of concern and awe. "The passengers are all so thankful, but we've got to get you out of here now. They're waiting for you outside." Leo nodded slowly, feeling a strange, heavy weight settle on his shoulders. He had done it, but now there was something more. The world was waiting. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was someone who had done the impossible. The attendant smiled warmly, her eyes filled with admiration. "You're a hero, you know that, right?" Leo didn't respond immediately. He simply stood up, his legs shaky as he stepped out of the cockpit. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door. The passengers were still talking excitedly, but there was a buzz in the air that was more than just relief. It was awe. When he stepped into the cabin, the clapping started again. The entire cabin seemed to erupt with a cheer that made Leo feel like he was being swallowed up by the noise. He stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to comprehend what was happening. People were looking at him as if he were some sort of legend, as if what he had done was the stuff of movies. The young boy who had taken control of the plane and saved them all. And there, near the back of the plane, his parents were standing. Their eyes were wide, their faces pale, but their gazes were locked onto him, their expressions full of something that Leo had never seen before. It wasn't just pride. It was wonder, astonishment. They were looking at their son in a way that made his chest swell with a mix of joy and disbelief. He walked toward them slowly, still feeling as though the ground beneath him might shift. It was all so surreal. But then, his father, Mark, was there, his arms open, pulling Leo into a tight hug. Leo felt his father's hands shaking slightly as he clung to him, and for the first time, he realized that his dad, the one who had always been skeptical of his dreams, was no longer looking at him with doubt. He was looking at him with something far more profound, respect. "You did it," Mark whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so damn proud of you." Leo didn't know what to say. For so long, he had dreamed of this moment, of hearing those words from his father. But now that it was happening, he didn't know how to process it. So, he just squeezed his dad back, feeling the weight of everything that had changed in just a few minutes. Emily, his mother, was next. She wrapped her arms around Leo, holding him tightly. "I was so scared," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I didn't know if we were going to make it. But you saved us all." Leo didn't know what to say. How could he explain the mix of fear, excitement, and calm that had come over him when he had taken control of the aircraft? How could he explain that, in those few minutes, he hadn't been the confused, misunderstood boy anymore? He had been a pilot, a real one. "It's over now, Mom," Leo said softly, the words almost too heavy for him to speak. "It's over, and we're all okay." Emily pulled away, wiping tears from her eyes as she smiled at her son. "You're amazing, Leo. You're incredible." Mark nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been wrong about a lot of things, haven't we? About you, about your dreams. I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner." Leo looked up at his parents, his heart swelling. This was more than he had ever imagined, more than any simulator could ever prepare him for. His parents were finally seeing him, the way he had always wanted them to, not just as the kid who spent too much time playing games, but as someone with real potential, someone with real talent. Suddenly, Leo felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned to see one of the flight attendants, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "They want you to come down to the tarmac, Leo. They're setting up a press conference. People want to meet the young hero who saved the flight." The mention of a press conference made Leo's heart skip a beat. The idea that he was about to face the media, to talk to reporters, to be thrust into the public eye, was terrifying. But there was something else there too. A small, quiet voice inside of him whispered that this was what he had always dreamed of. To be recognized for what he was capable of. To prove that his passion wasn't just a distraction, but the key to his future. With his parents beside him, Leo walked down the aisle toward the exit, where a team of reporters stood waiting. The bright lights of the cameras flashed as soon as he stepped into view, and the noise of the crowd reached a crescendo. It was a blur of questions, flashing lights, and voices calling his name. Leo felt his stomach tighten, but he stood tall, his posture straight, his shoulders squared. This was his moment. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a pilot, and the world was watching. "Leo, how does it feel to be called a hero?" one reporter shouted. "What made you step up and take control of the plane?" another asked. Leo took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice steady. "I just did what I had to do. It's what I've always wanted, to be a pilot. And when the time came, I knew I had to act. I had no other choice." There was a quiet pause before another reporter spoke up. "Do you think this will change your life?" Leo looked up at his parents, who were standing behind him, pride evident in their eyes. For the first time in his life, Leo felt like he was standing on solid ground. The doubts, the fears, the insecurities, they were all behind him now. "I think it already has," he said with a confident smile. "And it's just the beginning." The reporters scribbled down his words, their cameras flashing again. The crowd buzzed with excitement, and Leo realized that, for the first time, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't the misunderstood dreamer anymore. He was a young man who had taken control of his destiny, and the world was taking notice. As the reporters finished their questions and began to disperse, Leo felt a sense of calm wash over him. His parents were still beside him, their smiles as wide as his. They had seen him do something that had once seemed impossible, and now they were fully on board. The dreamer had become a hero, and nothing would ever be the same again. The world around Leo had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The airport was a buzz of activity, the flashing lights of cameras, the reporters, the news crews. It all felt like a dream. But standing next to his parents, hearing their words of pride and admiration, Leo realized that this wasn't a dream at all. This was his new reality, and it was one he had worked for his entire life. As the crowd began to thin and the media packed up their equipment, Leo felt a sense of peace settle over him. The weight of what he had accomplished, what he had done for the people on that plane, was starting to sink in. He had saved lives. He had brought a plane down safely, and in doing so, he had proven something even more important to himself and to the world. That his dreams, no matter how big or seemingly impossible, were worth pursuing. Walking through the terminal with his parents by his side, Leo could feel the stares, the whispers, the admiration of those around him. People recognized him now. His name was already being shared across news stations, social media, and even in the halls of schools across the country. The young boy who had taken control of a plane and landed it safely was now a hero, a symbol of determination and courage. But for Leo, the real triumph wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't in the fame or the accolades. The real triumph was in the quiet understanding he had gained, in the connection he had forged with his parents, who now finally saw him, not just as their son, but as someone capable of achieving extraordinary things. And for the first time, Leo felt that the years of dreaming, of struggling, had been worth it. As they reached the parking lot and got into the car, Leo's father, Mark, turned to him with a soft smile. "Leo," he said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion that Leo had never heard before, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened today, and I realize now that I was wrong to dismiss your dreams. I can't believe how much you've accomplished at such a young age. You've made me see that it's not just about what we think is possible. It's about what you believe in, and you've shown us all what that can mean." Leo's heart swelled at his father's words, and for the first time, he understood just how deep the bond between them really was. Mark had always been a man of logic and reason, someone who valued practicality over dreams. But Leo had proven that dreams, no matter how improbable, were worth chasing. And now, Mark believed it too. "Thanks, Dad," Leo said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never stopped believing in what I could do. I just needed the chance to show it." Emily, who had been silent up until now, spoke softly from the front seat. "You're going to be something great, Leo. I can feel it. Today was just the beginning." Her words were like a spark that lit something inside Leo, a quiet, unwavering certainty. Today had been a momentous achievement, But he knew, deep down, that his journey had only just begun. The flight simulators, the practice, the countless hours spent studying, all of it had led to this one pivotal moment. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Leo had always dreamed of becoming a pilot. He had always known that aviation was where his heart truly lay. And now, with the support of his parents, with the world recognizing his potential, that dream was within his reach. When they arrived home, Leo couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had spent so many years locked in his room, his mind focused on his virtual flights, feeling isolated from the world. But now, as he walked through the door, he realized that he wasn't just a boy in a room full of screens anymore. He was a young man with the skills, the passion, and the determination to do whatever he set his mind to. The following weeks were a whirlwind of interviews, media appearances, and offers from people in the aviation industry who were eager to meet the young hero who had defied expectations. But amidst all the chaos, Leo kept his focus on the one thing that had always mattered most to him: flying. He returned to his flight simulators, but now, it wasn't just about practice. It was about preparation for the future. He had set his sights on a real cockpit now, not a virtual one. He wasn't content with simply landing a plane in an emergency situation. He wanted to learn everything there was to know about aviation, to study the mechanics of flight, to master the intricacies of aircraft, and to one day earn his place among the pilots he had looked up to for so long. Mark and Emily supported him every step of the way. They knew this was no longer just a hobby for Leo. It was his passion, his calling. They signed him up for aviation courses, connected him with mentors in the field, and encouraged him to pursue his dream with the same dedication and fervor he had shown that fateful day in the sky. One day, a few months after the incident, Leo stood at an airport for the first time as a passenger, his heart pounding with excitement. He had been offered a scholarship to a prestigious aviation school, and today was the first step in his official training. As he looked around, he thought back to that day on the plane. How he had been thrust into the cockpit without warning. How he had taken control of a situation that no one else had been prepared for. But now, Leo was ready. He wasn't just reacting to a crisis. He was preparing for the future. As the plane lifted off the ground, Leo gazed out of the window at the vast expanse of the sky stretching out before him. The horizon was endless, full of possibilities. The dreamer, the young boy with a passion for flight, had become something more. He had become a pilot in the making. The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with tests and trials. But Leo no longer feared the unknown. He had already faced the greatest challenge of his life and had come through it with flying colors. Now, there was no limit to what he could achieve. The sky was no longer the limit. It was just the beginning. And as Leo looked out over the horizon, he knew that his dreams, once confined to virtual worlds, were now becoming his reality. The future was his to fly. Leo's journey had been one of dreams, doubts, and discoveries. From the boy who spent countless hours in his room, navigating flight simulators, to the young man who took control of a plane in the most extraordinary circumstances, his life had unfolded in ways that defied all expectations. The world had watched, marveled, and applauded his courage, but for Leo, it was never about the recognition. It had always been about proving to himself that passion, when nurtured and pursued with unwavering determination, could break through barriers and transform impossible dreams into reality. With each passing day, as he continued his training, he discovered new heights of knowledge, skill, and confidence. The cockpit, once a symbol of unattainable greatness, had become his classroom. His hands, once unsure on the controls, now moved with precision and calm. And the horizon, once a far-off, unreachable destination, was now his canvas. Mark and Emily, once skeptical of his dreams, now stood beside him, proud, supportive, and fully understanding that their son was destined for something greater. They had watched him grow, not just in skill, but in spirit. And as they witnessed Leo soar higher, they too learned an invaluable lesson. That dreams are not confined to the limits of what others believe is possible. Dreams are meant to be followed, nurtured, and given the freedom to take flight. Leo's story was a reminder to everyone who heard it that no matter how improbable or impossible a dream may seem, it is never too late to chase it. that courage, perseverance, and self-belief can turn the most ordinary of people into heroes, capable of extraordinary feats. As Leo sat at the controls of his first solo flight, the wind rushing past him, he smiled. The sky, vast and infinite, was his to explore. He had taken the first step toward his future, and nothing, no challenge or doubt, could ever take that from him. He was no longer just a boy with a dream. He was a pilot, and as the plane soared into the open sky, Leo knew that the journey was just beginning. Thank you so much for sticking with the story until the end. I hope you enjoyed it and felt the message of belief, perseverance, and the power of dreams. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any upcoming exciting content. Thank you again for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.